I'm happy to talk about Lag BaOmer and Sfirat HaOmer. Where would you like to begin? Is there something specific that you have a question about?
Well, I've heard actually a couple of things. Now, I understand the reason it's a sad period is because there was a plague going on, and I believe was it the students of Rabbi Akiva, I can't recall, who were dying during that time. And then when Lag BaOmer came, nobody died on that day, so it's considered a fun day. I remember when I was in Cheder in Hebrew school playing baseball at the back of the shul was the rabbi, and.
Well, those are certainly nice memories, Martin. I think we should clarify things for our viewers and our watchers on Facebook Live too. Who people are listening, people are watching, and it's always a good idea sometimes to go back to basics. And maybe after we talk about Sfirat HaOmer and Lag BaOmer, maybe we'll talk about some hot button issues too. Because I think that we can and should try to dent the darkness. And there's lots of it out there. And the airwaves are a wonderful place for that. And I say that with a sense of care and a sense of concern, because I know we always have detractors, but the truth must still be said. And it can be said, and it can make a difference. So firstly, let us begin with Sfirat HaOmer. This is a biblical commandment in the Torah that on the second day of Pesach, what is called Macharat HaShabbat, the day after the cessation of work that takes place as we observe Yom Tov on the first day of Passover, we bring a special grain offering in the Beit HaMikdash. It is referred to as Korban HaOmer. The Omer, for clarity's sake, is the measure of a particular chalice that was used in antiquity. It was maybe like the quart or the liter or the gallon as we might know it today. But specifically, the Omer, or this chalice, this measurement, was used in the Beit HaMikdash for a variety of different things, and it was used by the Jewish people to gather the manna, the miraculous food that fell from heaven day after day, with the exception of Shabbat, when a double portion would fall on Friday, and this went on for weeks and months, for decades, and in fact years, until the Jewish people were prepared to fulfill their destiny by crossing the Jordan River and entering the Holy Land of Eretz Yisrael, our eternal and ancestral homeland. And we'll talk about Eretz Yisrael with God's help a little bit later. So the Torah says, not only do we bring this firstling offering of grain, that's the first grain that's ripened in the new season, but once the grain is brought, the obligation of counting begins. We count the days of the Omer. And again, the Omer is a measurement. So on a literal level, we're counting the days that follow the bringing of a korban in the measure of an Omer, a grain offering in a certain chalice. And this chalice, incidentally, is something that it had almost like the ability to trigger a certain sense of memory, a certain sense of majesty, and a certain sense of connectivity for Jewish people. We know this because one of the images that is emblazoned on the coins that were printed during the Bar Kokhba era, Jewish coins, was the image of that chalice. We know that we, the Jewish people, in a way vastly different than all other governments, did not mint money with the faces of human beings. The old Greek coins and the Roman coins that we find, of course, are covered with the busts of the monarchs of the day. But you will never find the bust of a great Jewish political or Torah leader emblazoned on a coin. You will find things like the chalice, the Omer chalice. You will find things like in facade, an image of the Beit HaMikdash, which is how we know what somewhat of what the facade of the second Beit HaMikdash looked like. You will find things like a lulav and an etrog. Interestingly, you will not find actual imagery of the Beit HaMikdash. There is no menorah on any coins. There is no showbread or shulchan, the golden table. We don't have an altar depicted. And we don't have the cherubim, the ark, or the Decalogue, the Aseret HaDibrot. And the reason we don't have any of that, Martin, is because the Torah prohibits us replicating the things that are in the Beit HaMikdash. We are not allowed to build a synagogue in the image of the Beit HaMikdash, for example. We are not permitted to replicate the temple menorah in its precise form. And we're not allowed to replicate the golden table upon which the showbread stood, and certainly we are not allowed to replicate the cherubim and the ark. And because of this, incidentally, Jewish people, when they fashioned menorahs in antiquity, took care to depart from the image of the Beit HaMikdash menorah, and they would, as a rule, they would round the branches. Because in the Beit HaMikdash, the menorah was angular. We know this because Rashi describes the Beit HaMikdash menorah branches as al-achson, which is Hebrew for angular, and Maimonides, the great Rambam, even draws a picture of an angular menorah. The Maaseh Choshev, who was a great rabbi living in, I believe, the 16th century, if my memory doesn't fail me, he maintained that the menorah must have been round, well, because we find the menorah on Titus's ark, but he said most importantly because the Rambam uses verbiage which seems to indicate a round menorah. But later on we found a drawing that the Rambam made, and clearly he misunderstood the words of Maimonides. The Even Ezra is the only one of the major commentaries who suggests that the menorah is round, and as a rule, when we have a majority of sages who tell us a particular teaching, then that is the way the halacha should be established. Titus's ark represents galut, it represents the subjugation of the Jewish people. It is clearly not the Beit HaMikdash menorah. And the reason that most of the proverbial graffiti or the images or pictures or carvings of the day were round is because there was such a sense of reverence and awe for the Beit HaMikdash. Incidentally, yesterday, a group of Israeli soldiers in a defensive operation entered an ancient Jewish area occupied by some of the Arab population right now. And of course, they found Jewish artifacts because there are no other artifacts coming out of the ground. One of the things that they discovered yesterday, and Martin, anybody can Google this, the image is out there, is an angular menorah. So there are not many, but a number of angular menorah drawings that have been found. And the reason they aren't more ubiquitous is, as I said, because of that reason. So we don't have this on any of the coins. So what are we going to have on the coins? The answer is the Omer. The chalice in the Omer was not a formal artifact in the Beit HaMikdash. So people were comfortable using the Omer chalice or depicting it, and it brought a tremendous amount of hope. It represented renewal. The counting of the Omer is also symbolic of counting up from Passover, from Pesach, from our Egyptian Exodus, which took place 3,335 years ago. We were counting up to Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, and the festival of Shavuot. And just as we begin the counting of the Omer with a firstling offering, with the barley that is brought, on Shavuot, the firstling offering of wheat would be brought. So the Omer counting is bookended by two firstling offerings. The first, barley, and it was necessarily not leavened, not chametz. And then on Shavuot, the new wheat, and it was necessarily leavened. Two large breads of chametz. One of the reasons that we make a point of eating two meals on the day of Shavuot, one dairy and one meat. In other words, you have two separate meals because dairy and meat have to be eaten separately, is to commemorate the Shtei HaLechem, the two large chametz breads that were brought, the firstling offering that was brought in the Beit HaMikdash on the holiday of Shavuot. And that's how the Omer was observed. The Omer was observed as a time for us to move out of Exodus, out of our spiritual rebirth, and to prepare ourselves to receive the Torah and to accept the legacy of being a light unto the nations, which is an embodiment of what receiving the Torah means, Matan Toratenu, and the idea of Kabbalat Torah, receiving the Torah. God gives the Torah, we receive the Torah, God gives us a mission and a calling. He gives us the instructions, the guidance, the clarity, and the inspiration. We receive and accept that mission with humility, and the rest, as they say, is history. So that's what the Omer counting meant for Jewish people for a very, very long time. In the post-Second Beit HaMikdash era, we have one of the most disastrous periods in Jewish history. And in some ways, the disaster of the Bar Kokhba rebellion even eclipsed the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash itself. And there is not a lot of clarity as to what exactly happened during this period, and why the period of the Omer became a time of mourning. It is clear that the great Rabbi Akiva had established a cadre, a veritable army of Torah teachers, 24,000 incredible spiritual leaders, teachers of Torah who could uplift the Jewish people at this very, very low point in our national consciousness. And in a period of 33 days, 24,000 outstanding Torah leaders, the greatest scholars and sages, were massacred or died in a plague. We don't have clarity. We don't know if that means they were killed during the Bar Kokhba rebellion, or that there was a physical or material plague. If you ask me, my educated guess is that this was not a physical plague, but rather a plague inflicted upon us by the Romans. And, Martin, we almost cease to exist as a people, because we are not the people of bagels and lox. We are not the people of culture or a specific kind of language or Jewish names, all of which are nice, and it may have enabled us to keep our identity during the Egyptian bondage period, but subsequent to the Yetziah Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, and subsequent to the calling that Hashem had given us, the lofty calling of being Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of veritable priests and a nation that is holy, we have become defined not by virtue of the food or recipes that we eat or use, not by virtue of a particular form of dress or language that is used. We have been defined by Torah. As Reb Saadia Gaon said, Ein umeinu uma ela b'torata. Our nation is not a nation. We cannot have true definition save the definition of being a Torah people. And we didn't have any kind of self-determination in the land of Israel. In fact, almost nobody lived in the land of Israel. It was barren for centuries. Nobody was living in the land of Israel. Pitiful remnants of Jewish people living in the land of Israel. Some other nations who moved in and out constantly without any kind of permanence. No nation ever lived in the land that belonged to the Jewish people, the ancestral land of the Jewish people. Those are historical facts. You can see even the writings of Mark Twain from 1883 in the way he writes about the barren emptiness, the wasteland that today we call the state of Israel. This is a matter of public record and a fact. There are pictures of it, and it is demonstrable, and it was documented, and it is clear as day for anybody who wants to see the truth. At any rate, Martin, we continue to flourish. We continue to exist despite unimaginable challenges and daunting difficulties, despite endless persecution. We, the Jewish people, continued not only to exist, but to triumph. And our triumph was through Torah, through Talmud, through teaching. Our triumph was through our spiritual legacy, that which we were able to pass on from generation to generation, from the time of the Talmud, of our Chachamim, our sages, to the time of the Geonim, and from the period of the Geonim to the time of the Rishonim. As we moved through antiquity into the Middle Ages and into modernity, it was always Torah, its study and practice, that kept us as a people. And here we lost 24,000 of our most outstanding Torah leadership and sages. How could we survive? How would we survive? We don't even know how we survived, Martin, but miraculously we did. And Rabbi Akiva was able to create new students, and he was able to bring about a renaissance within the Jewish world by virtue of Torah study and its holy observance. And we observe a period of mourning for 33 days, and some begin that period on the second day of Pesach. but of course on Yom Tov there's no actual mourning, and it climaxes or concludes on the 33rd day of the Omer. Lag ba'Omer, Lamed Gimel is an American equivalent of 33. Others begin that morning on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and they conclude it on the third day of Sivan, which is called the Shloshet Yemei HaHagbalah, the 3 days of preparation for Matan Torah. But everybody, regardless of whether you observe the first custom, the second custom, or both customs, which incidentally is the practice of the Chabad community and many, many observant communities, the day of Lag BaOmer is always set aside as a day of joy. And years later, it was this day that was...
I remember, both my great-grandfathers all both had beards, but, it sort of ended with that generation, I think.
Talking about a beard, the Rebbe once pointed out that nobody ever depicts Moshe Rabbeinu, not even the non-Jewish artists who have chosen to try to paint or create statues of Moshe. Nobody thinks of Moshe Rabbeinu as beardless. Interesting. It's telling, and I would say compelling. And in Torah, there's this idea of not removing the facial hair if you're a man. And although there are leniencies and loopholes, according to the teachings of Kabbalah, beginning with the teachings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the facial hair for a man represents an extraordinary level of holiness and a special kind of connectivity. It's so odd to me that on the celebration of Lag BaOmer, which celebrates Kabbalah and its teachings, that people would choose to do the very opposite of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's teachings on his day of Simcha, on his day of joy. But be that as it may, I suppose it is what it is, Martin. And
Right. Well, there are examples too. Like it says, when Joseph was called to meet with Pharaoh, with the dream business, it says that he shaved and washed himself.
Shaved and washed himself is as in Yosef got a haircut. It doesn't say he removed his beard.
Well,
that's what the English translation says. It's not what the Hebrew says.
Right. Well, anyways, this one is, I find it a little scratchy and such. And anyways, people have told me I look better without it. So, but still, it's a way of sort of marking Lag BaOmer too, I suppose.
Well, it's a marking Lag BaOmer by doing the opposite of what it represents. I can't say you have me in agreement, but at any rate, you weren't asking. Let's talk about Lag BaOmer a little bit, Reb Martin, and let's talk about the truth, and let's talk about the darkness that seems to pervade our world.
We have a few minutes left, so let's do that.
I'll tell you what as I'm talking to you and thinking about both the reality of our world and Lag BaOmer, my attention is drawn to the 11th chapter of the prophecies of Isaiah, Yeshayahu Hanavi, where he speaks about the ingathering of the exiles in verse 11 and 12. And Yeshayahu Hanavi says, "V'haya bayoyim hahu," it'll come to pass on that day. And this, of course, refers to the day of the Geula, the day of the redemption, the day that Mashiach will come. Yosef Hashem Sheinit Yado liknot et sha'er amo. So then God will set his hand, the prophet said, again, a second time. In other words, a second time from the time of the Exodus from Mitzrayim. And he will do so. He will liknot et sha'or amo, to proverbially acquire or recover the remnants of his people, Asher Yisho'er, who will be left behind. And the prophet goes on to list a whole bunch of countries. It's very hard for us to know with certainty where these places are and what they might be referring to. Mitzrayim, Patros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, and Hamat and Iya Hayam. The truth is that we don't know with certainty where these places are, but these lands are said to represent the various parts of the globe in which the Jewish diaspora will be dispersed and will be found at the onset of redemption. And the prophet says, "V'nosa nes lagoyim," that he, meaning God, is going to set up a banner for the nations. And the meaning of a banner for the nations, as our sages explain in our tradition, is that Hashem will compel the nations of the world to facilitate the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, to assemble all of us. Osaf Nidche Yisrael, we will be assembled, the remnants dispersed, or the outcasts of Israel, and those who are Nefutzos Yehuda, the dispersed of Yehuda, will be gathered together, me'arba kanfei haaretz, from the proverbial four corners of the globe, reuniting our nation with God. And this idea of Isaiah the prophet, like so many biblical texts that speak to us about the future, that speak to us about the coming of Mashiach and about the ingathering, which is known as kibbutz galuyot, have to be understood as both literal as well as metaphorical and proverbial. Because the thing is this, Martin, it's not just about the Jewish people physically being in the land of Israel. Physicality is nice as long as physicality is accompanied with its spiritual meaning. If you have just a physical presence, but it doesn't have any spirit, it doesn't have any life, well, you have a corpse. You don't have a person. A human being is comprised of plasma, bone, sinew, and skin, and a neshama and a soul. And it's not just about a physical presence. It's not just about the Jewish people physically being in the land of Eretz Yisrael. The concept of galut represents not only a loss of territory or sovereignty or a looting of national landmarks and artifacts. The concept of galut represents this idea that in Eretz Yisrael we were privileged to have the presence of God amongst us in an overt and obvious way. And that galut means that God's presence melts into the background, where God's presence is no longer overtly and obviously seen. It doesn't mean he isn't with us. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai clearly states, and this is documented in Masechet Megillah on page 29 and elsewhere in the Talmud, that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai taught that Chavivin Yisrael Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we the Jewish people are beloved and cherished in his eyes, B'chol Makom Shegalu Shechina Imohem. In every place that we are exiled, the Shechina, the divine presence, goes with us, and Hashem's presence is going to return with us at the time of the ingathering, as it is written. V'shov Hashem Elokecha es shavutcha. It says in the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 30, it says that God will come back with his captives. It doesn't say that God will bring back. It says he will come back. V'heshiv lo nemer ela v'shov. It doesn't say he will bring us back. He will come back. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai taught Malamed Shakadosh Baruch Hu Shov Imohem Ibein HaGaluyot, that God is going to return together with us. And Martin, this is the point I want to make to you, to our listeners, to anybody watching on Facebook, and anybody who will see this in the future. Galut is not merely a physical thing, and the land of Israel is not simply a place of safe haven for a persecuted people. The concept of living in Eretz Yisrael represents the overt presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the climax of which will be realized with the rebuilding of the third Beit HaMikdash and the Shechina amongst us in a manifest way. And that doesn't mean that the Shechina, that God's presence is not with us. God is always with us, Martin. However, we are waiting for that ingathering, and that ingathering represents not only the physical ingathering of the entirety of the nation of Israel from every far corner of the world to its ancestral homeland, but rather it means, in addition with that physical arrival in the holy land of Eretz Yisrael, it means that the presence of Hashem will radiate. The most pious and the most egregious of sinner, the athletically inclined and the harshly crippled, every single member of Am Yisrael is coming home, and the presence of Hashem is going to be felt and seen in the most obvious and overt way. And guess what? Guess what, Martin? The nations of the world are going to be compelled to cooperate and to assist in this mass immigration. They will offer unimpeded access to the land of Israel.
But I'm afraid we're out of time right now, Rabbi Kaplan. However, we will be speaking again tomorrow, and hopefully we can continue with this.
I hope to continue this message tomorrow. I want to remind everyone who will listen that very, very soon there will be a Tekah b'shofar gadol. A great shofar is going to sound. It will herald our redemption, and it will introduce the world to a whole new reality, a time in which the presence of God will be seen and known by felt of all of humanity, brought to the world via a nation of Yisrael that lives in its homeland and celebrates its faith and its legacy and tradition in the Beit HaMikdash, bringing peace and prosperity, goodness and godliness to all of the world's population. may we merit to see that great day unfold before our very eyes, bimheira ubiyameinu speedily, and in our days. Amen. And I guess that's all for the radio program. Thanks for joining. Have a great